East. World powers reportedly making headway with Iran on a historic nuclear deal as Israelis vote to determine the fate of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, one of Obama's biggest critics in these nuclear negotiations. At least one exit poll shows, two exit polls show Benjamin Netanyahu with a slight lead. Here with what's at stake, Fox News National Security Analyst K.T. McFarland and former U.N. Ambassador John Bolton. Let me give you the results of those exit polls. They are tied in two, Netanyahu ahead in one, so he would appear to be doing well, and he's already tweeting what a great victory he has. KT, to you, tell us a little bit about how the system works there. It's a parliamentary system. Are we headed towards a coalition government?
Yeah, of some sort. The difference in our system is the guy who gets the most votes wins. In Israel, the guy who gets the most votes doesn't necessarily win because he probably doesn't have 51% of the electorate. And that's what's going to happen this time. They'll both do well. They might even tie. But what has to happen now is each of the two leading parties have to scramble around with other minority parties to see who can form a government. We may not know who the new prime minister of Israel is for weeks.
Wow. This could go on for a while. Ambassador, to you, what kinds of consequences could this have for the U.S.?
Well, depending on what coalition emerges, it could have a pretty important impact on Israel's foreign policy. And there are really three possibilities that the Israelis have been discussing. One is Netanyahu wins and is able to put together a coalition. The other is the Labor Party candidate Herzog wins, and it's more of a center-left coalition. And the third possibility is a government of national unity, which is not something we've had experience with before. So it's very uncertain. This is obviously very close. And it's important to understand in Israeli terms, a lot of this election turned on domestic economic issues, not on a repudiation, if that's what happens, of Netanyahu's foreign policy.
I hear there's a lot of concern about the economy, which is stunning to me because their economy has done so much better than ours, frankly. But KT, to you, I'm most interested in these nuclear negotiations with Iran. What effects might this election tonight have on that?
Well, I was in Israel in December and talked to people of all the political parties. And what seemed to be the case is they seem to have pretty much agreement on Iran. They may have a disagreement on how to deal with the Palestinians and whether to negotiate with the Palestinians or not. But with regard to Iran, almost everybody agrees a nuclear Iran is an existential threat to Israel, cannot be allowed to happen. So let's fast forward to the end of the month where potentially Secretary Kerry has a nuclear deal with Iran. The president, our president, will say, oh, it's all great. Secretary Kerry will say it's going to stop Iran's nuclear program. But the reality is, what do the countries in the region say? What do they think? How are they judging this? And if the countries in the region, particularly Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Arabs, Turkey, if they conclude that what this is a nuclear deal whereby Iran doesn't dismantle anything, it just unplugs the nuclear program for a little bit of time, they could then start getting nuclear weapons of their own. And whereas Israel, it's in the middle of a nuclear arms race in the most unstable part of the world.
Yeah, the consequences could obviously be tragic. Ambassador, to you, you've been highly critical of these negotiations. What's your take tonight? KT just mentioned the end of March deadline that they're facing. What's going to happen? Can anything good come of this?
No, if they sign the deal today, it would simply be an open path for Iran to get nuclear weapons. And it doesn't much matter how much longer they negotiate. I just think we'll be making more concessions, which the Iranians get sort of more and more every day. The real issue, though, now is, and this is why the outcome of the election in Israel is critical, is if Netanyahu wins and if this deal goes through, will Israel strike Iran's nuclear weapons program, as it has twice before in its history struck nuclear weapons programs in the hands of hostile states? So there are a lot of ifs involved, but that's the key decision that Israel faces.
We've talked a lot on the show about the letter that the GOP sent to Iran about the agreement, people who are very upset that the president is negotiating this. KT, to you, I want you to hear what Josh Earnest had to say in reaction to this and then get your comment. Here's Josh Earnest.
There will be ample opportunity for members of Congress to both evaluate the political agreement in the short term, to consider the technical agreement that is supposed to be reached by the end of June, and then not over the course of weeks and not over the course of months, but over the long term, evaluate Iran's commitment to complying with the terms of the agreement.
All the time in the world, K.T., what do you say?
Well, that's exactly the opposite of what Secretary Kerry just said last week. You know, a year ago, Secretary Kerry said Congress has a role in this. And remember, Congress was the organization that put those sanctions on the table. But now Secretary Kerry, even last week, said, well, we don't really think we have to go to Congress. Congress does not have a role. Maybe we'll go to the United Nations instead of the U.S. Congress. But at the end of the day, the problem with the deal is much worse than no deal. A bad deal is worse than no deal. Why? Because if the United States lifts sanctions and Iran is considered a nuclear weapons threshold state, Iran rides the table. They have a superior economy. They have an economic boom. It's going to be like the California gold rush as international companies rush to do business with Iran, and Iran will be a threshold nuclear weapons state.
Ambassador, quick thoughts before we go.
Well, I think the outcome of the Israeli election is the most important issue before us. I think Obama will do almost anything to sign this deal, and I think if he does, it's essentially a guarantee that Iran will have nuclear weapons in many other states in the region, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Turks, and others. If Netanyahu wins, he then has a very hard decision to make whether to attack the Iranian program. If he does not, Iran will get nuclear weapons.
Disturbing thought. K.T. and Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for your time. And, of course, if we get any news in this hour on the election, we'll bring it to you straight away. And a nuclear